Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Glass Gecko. I'm your host, Glass Gecko, and I hope you all had a very, very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. There are a few countries which have had a more tumultuous story through the 20th century as Cambodia. Perhaps its eastern neighbour Vietnam steals the spotlight in 20th century history a little bit, but the story of Cambodia's brutal suffering under the Khmer Rouge has forged one of the most tragic tales of the last century. I myself am half Thai, and being a student of history, I found it my obligation to study Southeast Asia, and this video in particular is something I've wanted to talk about for quite some time. Despite my family's home country of Thailand recently going to war with Cambodia, I have no ill will to the average Cambodian person. It certainly won't sway my view of its history one way or another. You see, Cambodian music, or in this case we're mainly looking at Khmer rock, grew a distinct music scene around the capital city of Phnom Penh. Its blend of traditional Khmer music and Western influence has led to a wide following, not just in Cambodia, but even around the world. However, this would come under siege, horrific siege, with the Khmer Rouge. Under the rule of the Khmer Rouge, many Cambodians would die. Amongst them were many famous Cambodian musicians. There's no question to be asked in this video. I just want to tell the tale of how a brutal regime attempted to eradicate Cambodian culture, but also how the Cambodian people never let it happen. There'll be more focus on history than some of my other videos, but I feel it's very important to the topic and it's really where I want to take this channel. I would also greatly appreciate if you would like and subscribe to the channel, especially if music and history is a topic that interests you. I'm really trying to consistently upload more and I very much appreciate you watching. But now, let's just jump into a short history lesson. Cambodia has a long history. Since the days of the Great Khmer Empire, a cultural identity was formed and refused to disappear. Despite being engulfed through kingdom conquests with its neighbours and colonial efforts by France and Japan, Cambodia is just another example of a determined peoples. But the specific history of its 20th century story is relevant to this video, and before we look at the music and Khmer Rouge rule, I wanted to look at the history more broadly. You see, even before World War II, European nations had a very precarious hold on their Asian colonies. When Japan enacted their own blitzkrieg of Southeast Asia, European hegemony collapsed. Unlike other Asian countries liberated by the Japanese, Cambodia saw relatively less human atrocity than others, but was more so put to work for resource exploitation. When handed back to France after the war, the Southeast Asia situation really became untenable. Countries were gaining independence globally, and France was really struggling to keep a lid on Vietnam. Cambodia was able to leverage independence efforts politically, and in 1953 the country gained full independence. This was fully ratified in the Geneva Conference of 1954. From this point, Cambodia enjoyed access to greater freedoms. Western radio, films and tourism all brought Western music and culture to urban centres. By the 50s and 60s, as you'll probably know, Western music was beginning to go through a modernising transition of its own. This translated extremely well to Cambodia. Cambodian musicians enjoyed blending Western styles with traditional Khmer music, but we'll talk about that in the next section. Whilst Cambodia was independent, it was going through a period of internal political struggle. North Vietnamese forces were using bases and the Ho Chi Minh Trail to work around American and South Vietnamese forces. And although the Cambodian king Norodom Sihanouk told America he really had no problem with their campaign against Vietnam, he himself did nothing to expel the Vietnamese forces. Understandably, Cambodia was trying to stay neutral and recover stability after recent independence, but the growing influence of communism led to a polarising effect on Cambodia. This disunity would fester until the Khmer Rouge, officially called the Communist Party of Kampuchea under infamous Pol Pot, led an insurgency. Although the people voted for the right wing, King Norodom Sihanouk's aversion to cozy up to the United States led to a weakening position. In 1970, a right-wing insurrection would overthrow the king and declare an expulsion of the communists. Due to North Vietnam being allowed to operate in Cambodia, America and ARVN saw it fair to invade Cambodia, specifically to destroy those Vietnamese bases. This resulted in massive support for the Khmer Rouge and allowed a North Vietnamese counterattack, which it quickly succeeded in, giving captured land to the growing Khmer Rouge. In 1972, the disunited government became the Khmer Republic, but corruption and civil war had crippled its power. The Khmer Rouge were growing. They were growing independent and utilising extreme nationalist promises to gain further support. By 1975, after a major Khmer Rouge assault, the capital fell. With it, the new republic. Cambodia was officially under Khmer Rouge control. Well known as being one of the most brutal regimes of the communist states, tradition and Cambodian history was essentially outlawed. Music was repressed. We'll talk more about how Khmer Rouge ideology and what this meant for Cambodian music a little later in the video. Despite claiming communism, the Khmer Rouge would skirmish with Vietnam, who in turn reversed a large-scale invasion, essentially dismantling the Khmer Rouge control and bringing the country under de facto Vietnamese control. This was until Vietnam withdrew in 1989, and through periods of political transition, Cambodia would find itself independent. In 1992, it would begin the long road to recovery, a road that the country is still on. From 1975 to 1979, the Khmer Rouge was responsible for the deaths of approximately 1.5 to 2 million people, around a quarter of the population at the time. It breaks my heart looking at footage of Cambodia during the late 50s and 60s, and what would happen just years later. This was a brief look at the history, but I thought it was important to know the context before we moved on. But now, let's look at the music. The golden age of Cambodia may have been the Khmer Empire, but the musical golden age is said to have occurred from independence to Khmer Rouge control. After independence, Cambodia adopted greater ideas of westernisation, fashion, art and music, and blended this perfectly with traditional Khmer music. Along with traditional Cambodian instruments, electrical music hit the scene. Electric guitars and bass, as well as professional drum kits, collaborated with traditional Cambodian folk lyrics and dance. In Phnom Penh, young people adopted Western fashion and flashy cars, and dance halls and clubs became ever more popular. Western culture was hitting the urban youth, and this was no accident. You see, King Sihanouk understood the importance of art and heavily funded its projects. He himself was a musician and contributed to the Western blend, allowing the music not to sound foreign, but simply exist as a new genre in Cambodian pop. Khmer rock as it's known. As I said before, it absolutely breaks my heart seeing footage of this golden age, knowing what would happen only a decade later. If we look at the music specifically, there are key differences between Western and Asian music. Western music, especially during the 60s, used primarily major and minor scales with a focus on harmony. In Western music, the harmony of all instruments is a key aspect. This is why Western music is built on chords. In Southeast Asian music, the emphasis was on melody. Traditional Southeast Asian instruments would act as the lead, with other instruments playing their own melodies underneath. This is different from, say, how a Western guitar solo would play over a chord structure, not loads of other little guitar melodies, for example. So when Western music hit the scene, Cambodian musicians began to adapt chord structures and scales whilst incorporating string and brass melody on top to create a pretty unique and distinct sound, very clearly influenced by Western rock and jazz, but also keeps its very recognisable Khmer identity. It's in this environment we see key Cambodian figures come of age. Now, I'm not Cambodian, so I apologise if I pronounce these badly, but artists like Pan Ron and Ross Seray-Sathia, as well as other key figures, invigorated the pop scene, and the spotlight of this video is a man named Sin Sisamut. It is actually unclear as to when Sisamut was born exactly. He grew up in the northern provinces of Cambodia, where he began learning string instruments at a very early age. It was after his school graduation he came to study in Phnom Penh in the guise of becoming a doctor to please his parents. He really wanted to chase his dream of music. His graduation coincided with Cambodian independence, and it's then he picked up his first record deal. From here, he would land roles singing at royal state functions, growing close with royalty, utilising traditional Khmer folk and classical sounds for his love ballads. By the 50s and early 60s, pop music was starting to spread, and Sisamut adapted perfectly to the Phnom Penh culture. And as the 60s progressed, rock and roll was gaining traction. Thanks to American troops stationed in South Vietnam, the latest 60s rock and roll stars were spread through the country, and a very unique spectrum of Western ballad music to Latin jazz was broadcast. Sisamut did it all, welcoming the new sounds and pushing the Cambodian scene into a new age. By this point, Sisamut had become pretty well known. He was a well-known celebrity in Cambodia and collaborated often with other big artists, even writing songs for Cambodian films. In fact, he was so prolific, he's said to have written well over 1,000 songs. On top of original pieces, he covered famous songs from the West, including White a Shade of Pale by Procol Harum, which honestly blows my mind. That's how experimental and embracing of Western music Cambodia was, to cover Procol Harum. It turns out Cambodia was especially fond of psychedelic rock and funk. His high status and willingness to adapt to Western culture, as well as his work with the Cambodian military, made him a key target when the Khmer Rouge came to power. He would eventually die during the Cambodian genocide. However, how this happened exactly is unknown. I didn't just want to look at Sisamut because he was the biggest, but also because his story is essentially a microcosm of the growing Khmer rock scene and the brutal repression it suffered when the Khmer Rouge came to power. I've covered in previous videos how powerful the cultural effects of music can be, and when you look at Cambodian city life during this period, it's no doubt Western music had brought individualistic culture to the Cambodian youth, and if things had stayed that way, perhaps Cambodia would have flourished. But as it was, the Cambodian people were about to suffer one of the worst atrocities in history. I already covered a brief Cambodian history and how the Khmer Rouge came about, but let's talk now about how they suppressed culture and how Cambodian music itself suffered. The Khmer Rouge had a radical belief of year zero. Cambodia had to start from scratch. The history, religion, tradition and culture that existed, well, it needed to be completely extinguished, and people needed to understand there was no individualism, there was only the state. The regime was so radical as to believe the existence of cities and urban life was globalised elitism, and thus all life must be rural and agricultural. Every major city was evacuated and the people put to work. These so-called new people were persecuted more, but the old people still suffered. Now, this may seem quite bizarre. As I said earlier in the video, the group was staunchly nationalist. Most nationalist countries have very strong links to their history and culture, but this is just another reason as to why this topic is so interesting. The Khmer Rouge might have been one of the least logical authoritarian regimes in history, and for its people, this incompetence led to hell. In a very direct and practical sense, we can first talk about the killings themselves. Under Khmer rule, many singers, composers, actors, artists, writers and teachers were killed. All those musicians who contributed to the beautiful golden age would be worked to death, often executed in brutal fashion due to their status. Contributing to the arts was seen as aristocratic and urban. It was seen by the Khmer Rouge to be an influence of foreign culture and thus must be exterminated. it wasn't just westernised pop that was outlawed. The Khmer Rouge essentially outlawed all music, unless it was used for propaganda purposes. This even included traditional music and religious music, as it was seen as an extension of royal and aristocratic rule. All those jobs listed were seen as exploitative to the working people and spreading of old ideas. It's estimated that around 90% of musicians were murdered in this period. It's in these killings Sin Sisamut and his contemporaries were killed too. Despite circumstances not being known exactly, it is certain to say they died by the hands of the Khmer Rouge. Places where Western culture could spread were destroyed as well. Recording studios and record shops were demolished and vinyls and sheet music were burned. Instruments were put to the flame or abandoned. A huge amount of Cambodia's musical culture was physically erased. Again, due to the Khmer Rouge's view of culture, even centuries-old scriptures were put to the flame. I mean, this sounds bad enough, but you must also remember, in the West we're used to preserving history essentially exclusively in written and recorded form for future teaching. What was normal in Cambodia was oral tradition. When teachers and musicians were killed, a lot of musical knowledge was killed with them forever. Young people grew up not knowing their own cultural heritage. Besides the intentional effects, there were also the indirect effects which harmed every aspect of creativity. When you're being worked to death all the hours of the day, well, there's no time or freedom to create. Even if you had a moment for yourself, well, you would be so exhausted and malnourished your brain wouldn't be able to operate creatively. Silence every day created and hammered into people a new culture, one of emptiness and state worship only. As I say, some music was allowed, but this music was purely for propaganda. Don't be fooled by the fact some of it actually sounds quite cool. It was usually performed by young adults and children in order to mould their brains into acceptance of state propaganda at a very early age. This music offered no electrical or westernised influence at all. Well, no electrical apart from the speakers which would blare out the propaganda music and messages as the people worked. Some traditional music was technically allowed, a very small amount, as long as the music contained absolutely no connection to religion, romance, emotion or politics, but even then it was tightly controlled. However, this of course was not a tribulation shared by the elites. Pol Pot and his lackeys enjoyed Khmer rock privately, as well as French and Chinese music, which had previously circulated Cambodia. Don't forget, a lot of the Khmer Rouge elite studied in Paris when they were younger. Well, they were more than familiar with westernised culture than you may think. Rules for thee, not for me. The aftermath of this rule was devastating. Not only was the loss of human life and culture a complete abhorrence, but the trauma this ordeal caused to millions of people left them scarred and mentally unwell. Even after the Khmer collapse, people were afraid to perform or write music, like a shell shock of creativity. Styles had to be relearnt, but relearn they did. This whole 4-year period is almost mythological in its cruelty. There's rarely been such a significant crime against humanity for such little gain or prospect. But Cambodia didn't just sit there and wallow in its pity. The Cambodian people proved to be strong, and they would not let their cultural heritage be forgotten. I am right now recording a video about Cambodian music, whilst Cambodian music is playing in the background and Cambodian footage is playing on your screen. But how? 90% of musicians and teachers were killed. The country was left scarred and disfigured, so what happened after Khmer rule? Well, there's two key aspects to look at: the government and the people. Once the regime fell, the new government heavily encouraged restoration of culture and art. Understanding that the progress made through the 50s and 60s was key, the government made it a top priority to recover. The University of Fine Arts was reopened and the youth were encouraged to develop. The small amount of survivors from artistic and educated backgrounds were highly sought after and tasked with teaching and rebuilding traditional art and music. even after decades, the Cambodian government puts funding into restoring and recovering culture. Once the Vietnamese had withdrawn fully, Cambodia lengthened its support for educational reform and Khmer traditions. Crucial to this success was the involvement of foreign aid and NGOs whose funding made restoration efforts possible. As for the people, there were many individual stories I would recommend you read. They talk about their memories and how they kept their secrets hidden from Khmer authorities, or how they fled to refugee camps for safety, effectively becoming human archives of Cambodian culture. Refugees who were able to flee before or during the regime used various methods to reconstruct Khmer rock. This could be as simple as playing from memory, or having to use fragments of sheet music or partially damaged tapes to work from. A lot of experimentation and collaboration was used, and for many it took decades to fully remaster and re-record the music. To this day, the Golden Age is still being uncovered and relearned. It's through these collective efforts that we still have the gift of Khmer rock to listen to today, and the artists themselves have not been forgotten. The Cambodian people still hold this era and musicians in high regard. In fact, there's recently been a documentary released by Cambodian media about Sissamut with a focus on how Cambodian music has been preserved, and it's a part of identity that cannot be erased. To this day, many Cambodian musicians pay tribute to Sissamut and the Cambodian Golden Age, and its musical sound is still reproduced in modern Cambodian music. The Khmer Rouge failed. They failed to the point where I, a random guy sitting in front of a camera in England, can talk and spread the legacy of Cambodian music. The music of Cambodia's Golden Age is in of itself interesting, but when you look at the history and tragedy surrounding it, it makes this particular music scene almost legendary. To see a country embrace culture and develop its own style, which is enjoyed by millions even today, despite the attempted eradication of its identity, is extremely interesting, and I personally think it's one of the most interesting stories of music history that I know of. You see, music is culture. It's not necessarily about what notes you hit or what image you use for an album cover. It's about what the music and the people represent. We all have our treasured artists, we all have our favourite songs. Every piece of music has an identity and a reason. The music of Sissamut and the Golden Age isn't just music, it's a direct representation of Cambodia's resilience and development. It's a representation of a culture which embraced Western ideas and turned it into something of its own. People didn't try so hard to remember Sissamut just because he sounded good, but because his music resonates with the fact Cambodian culture never disappeared. And to that, I dedicate this video. I've been Glass Gecko, and thank you so much for watching.